Okay, today we're on to chapter 17, section number 3. So this is a really important section which leads off into the Protestant Reformation. One thing I'll say as a little disclaimer here is that these are not my personal views, but rather a conglomeration of historical data and facts. These are not coming from me in my opinion anyway. This is more so just some generally accepted historical data based on what was going on in the Catholic Church and of course, in the ideas of Martin Luther, which sort of combated some of the things that were going on in the church. So first of all, we have to understand, hey, what were the causes of the Reformation? What led to these changes that people wanted to make in the Catholic Church? First off, Renaissance views were a very big part of that. The emphasis on the secular ideology and the concept of the individual sort of challenged what the church was teaching. The printing press, while it was spreading religious ideas in books like the Bible was the first book ever printed, it also spread secular ideas. There is a major chart. It's on page 488 of your book. It talks about the social, the political, the economic, and of course the religious factors that led into the Reformation. So let's take a look at that real quick. You can see here on the chart that it focuses on the social, the political, the economic, and the religious. For example, some of the things that I just mentioned, Renaissance values of humanism and secularism led people to question the church. Other social ideas dealt with the printing press, helped spread ideas that were critical of the church, while it also spread ideas that were beneficial for the church as well. People who are running printing presses, they want to make money, so whoever's going to pay them to produce their book, they're going to take it. Political, powerful monarchs also challenged the church as the supreme power in Europe, such as Henry VIII, who we'll learn about at the end of this section, of England. Also, many leaders viewed the Pope as a foreign ruler and challenged his authority. Economically speaking, European princes and kings were actually jealous of the church's immense wealth, and merchants and others resented having to pay taxes to the church in the form of tithes. Some of the blatantly religious topics, though, some church leaders had become worldly, secular, and also corrupt. A lot of this had to do with lay investiture and simony. So a lot of them, the bishops and priests, were not being appointed by the church. Rather, they were being appointed by the king. So that was really not something that the church was for. It was hard for them to control. Many people also found church practices such as the sale of indulgences, which we're going to talk about here heavily, as unacceptable. So these are some of the factors that really lead into the Reformation. Prior to this time, as far as the Christian world is concerned, there was Byzantine Orthodox and there was Roman Catholic. Now we're going to get after this, we're going to have a split into many other denominations here coming in this section. So capital B, we'll talk about some of the criticisms that the church faced at this time. These are people who criticized the church. These are some of the things that they pointed at. They pointed to the church being corrupt, especially in leadership. They argued that popes were patrons of the arts, spending church money on personal pleasures and also getting involved in fighting wars. Some of the lower clergy, which would be like your priests, were generally poorly educated overall. Some of them were married. Some of them had drinking and gambling problems. Okay, we'll take it for what it is. Capital letter C, early calls for reform. You've got two individuals that even prior to Martin Luther, who we're going to talk about today, that really started to talk about changing the church, and then two others that continued those efforts. John Wycliffe and Jan Hus taught that the Bible actually had more authority than church leaders did. And then Desiderius Erasmus, who we learned about in section 2, and Sir Thomas More. Sometimes you can see Thomas More with two O's, sometimes you'll see it with one O. They believe that you should also study the Bible to reform the church, but that Christians should be Christians of the heart rather than following all of the rules and laws and doctrines, but really just trying to be good people is what they argued. So those are some of the early calls for reform, not as aggressive as Martin Luther would be. So here we're going to take a look at Roman numeral number 2, which is talking about how Martin Luther challenges the church directly. First of all, Martin Luther was Catholic. He was a monk and a teacher at the University of Wittenberg, which is in Germany. Through studying the Bible, he became convinced that faith alone was actually the key to salvation. And so through this study, he comes up with the 95 Theses. These are Luther's basic issues that he sees with the church and how it can change. when I look at this and study this, well, this is my personal opinion. I think in looking at it, Luther was trying to get the church to be better, not really separate and break the church apart at first. And then it sort of did kind of continue to matriculate into different things. But his initial issue was with the Catholic Church allowing Johann Tetzel, a friar, to sell indulgences in this area that he was living in. Indulgences are basically a pardon that releases a person from punishments due for a sin. In essence, you could look at it as like buying your way for forgiveness or buying your way into heaven. It was in response to this that Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, or formal statements / arguments against why some of these things were wrong. These statements were then posted by Luther on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg in the year 1517. Then, of course, these ideas are then propagated through the printing press and spread throughout much of Germany. This starts off what's known as the Reformation, a movement of religious reform that led to the founding of many Christian churches that do not follow the Pope's authority. Luther's main teachings, there really are three of them. These are the ones that you can really break down. He said, first of all, that people could win salvation through faith in God's gift of forgiveness. The church taught that, okay, to get salvation, you have to have faith and good works, okay? All church teachings, according to Luther, should be clearly based on the words of the Bible. He also argued that both the church and the Pope were false authorities, eventually, he said. And then all people with faith were equal, according to, of course, Martin Luther. He says, therefore, you don't need priests to interpret the Bible for you. Those were basically his three major tenets. How did people respond to what Luther was doing here? Well, the Pope really wasn't very happy about this. Many people were gravitating to the beliefs of Martin Luther because some people had unhappiness toward the church at this time anyway. And then as Luther's ideas become more and more popular among the general population, the Pope realized, hey, this is a serious threat. Although Luther's goal was actually to be a good Christian and not to start a revolution, he did actually state at one point that Christians should drive the Pope from the church by force. So that's where he kind of changes over into this more violent and very aggressive approach. And so in 1520, the Pope at the time, Pope Leo X, which is Pope Leo X, threatened Luther with excommunication unless he would recant or take back his statements. Luther said, I'm not going to take back a word. He then challenged the church officials to a debate, so it kind of exacerbated the problem, and Pope Leo excommunicated Luther. Other opposition came from Charles V, who was actually the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. He was opposed to Luther's teachings as well. He summoned Luther to the town of Worms in 1521 to stand trial. At this trial, Luther refused to recant his statement. Let's take a look at what he actually said here on page 490. I'll take you to that direct quote. All right, here's what he says, guys, at this trial. He says, I am bound by the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not retract anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. I cannot do otherwise. Here I stand. May God help me. Amen. So he was not going to back down. And what ended up happening is then Charles V, who's kind of in charge as the ruler of Germany, Spain, parts of northern Italy, he issues an order called the Edict of Worms. Basically declared that Martin Luther was an outlaw and a heretic. And back then, if you were declared an outlaw, it meant that no one in the empire was legally allowed to give you food or shelter. And it also ordered that all of his writings and books be burned. There was one person who helped Luther out. His name was Prince Frederick of Saxony. He disobeyed the emperor's orders. He saved Luther by providing him private shelter in one of his castles. While Luther was there, he actually translated the Bible into German so that more German people could actually read the words that he was preaching about. This led off into a group called the Lutherans. It was a religious group made up of Luther and his followers. It is still a Christian denomination today. Protestant denomination is what it's called today. Capital letter C, the Peasants' Revolt then took place. In 1524, German peasants took these changes and reforms to the next level by actually demanding an end to serfdom. Bands of angry peasants went about raiding monasteries, pillaging, and burning. Luther did not technically teach this, and he did not agree with the actions of the peasants. And this was actually bad, because what happened to the peasants when Luther did not back them is that they were actually killed off by the ruling bodies that they were living in. And so this was actually pretty problematic. Luther lost a lot of prestige because of his failure to back these peasants who thought that they were actually living up to his words. Next is capital letter D, talking about Germany at war. In 1529, you had two sides to the battle lines that were drawn. You had princes in Germany that supported the Pope, and you had princes in Germany that supported Martin Luther. They became known as the Protestants, meaning protesting against the church. So Protestants is a term applied to Christians that belong to non-Catholic churches. And there is an insert in the textbook on page 491 that shows you all the different Protestant divisions and sectors here that branched off of Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, which then gets us into Episcopalian, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal. You also have Calvinism, which talks about the Presbyterian Church and the Reformed Church. So you've got a lot of different groups that sprout off of this. And then down here, it talks about some of the differences in the religious beliefs of these several denominations and groups. So an important page here to actually study. Okay, next, moving on down the way, we're going to take a look at the Peace of Augsburg. So this fighting between German princes was ended by the Peace of Augsburg. Charles V ordered that all German princes come together at the city of Augsburg, where they agreed that each individual ruler would have the chance to decide what religion their state could practice within Germany. So this was actually a major loss for Catholicism, because prior to this, the regular state of affairs in Germany was that everybody was Catholic. Here, this Peace of Augsburg allowed for princes that might be Protestant or supporters of Martin Luther to allow their region to be Protestant. So this was actually overall a major loss for Charles V and, of course, Catholicism in general there. Okay, so for Roman numeral 4, we're going to talk about how England, this eventually spreads to England under the rule of Henry VIII. Henry VIII took the English throne in 1509 as a devout Catholic. At first, he was actually opposed to the teachings of Martin Luther. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had only one child, a daughter named Mary. He actually needed a male heir to the throne. By 1527, he becomes convinced that his first wife, Catherine, who was at the age of 42, was too old to have a child. He wanted to divorce her and take a younger queen, but the church did not allow divorce. Henry went directly to the Pope and asked for an annulment to his marriage. An annulment is basically to cancel or put an end to a marriage. It basically is the church says that they recognize that the marriage never actually existed. The Pope actually refused to grant the annulment for Henry's marriage. The reason behind this is kind of odd. Basically, Catherine was Charles V's nephew. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, so she was his aunt. And of course, Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor has a good relationship with the Pope. So we've got a little bit of politics being played here. But nonetheless, the Pope can choose whether he wants to grant the annulment or not. And they said no. Turns out, guys, that Henry VIII was actually having an affair on his wife anyway. It's a pretty touchy subject. Then what happens is Henry forms what's called the Reformation Parliament. He tried to solve this problem in 1529 by calling the Parliament in to end the Pope's power in England. This was known as the Reformation Parliament. In 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn, who was actually in her 20s. He was having a relationship with her while he was still married to Catherine, by the way. So he was cheating on his wife. Parliament then legalized Henry's divorce from Catherine, and then he invoked what's called the Act of Supremacy. It called for all people to take an oath recognizing that Henry and not the Pope was the official head of the church. And this is where I told you guys the story in section 2 that Thomas More would not take this oath, and he remained a devout Catholic. And because of this, he was arrested, imprisoned. he was found guilty of treason and executed in 1535 by orders of King Henry. Let's talk about some of the consequences of Henry's changes. Anne Boleyn, his mistress, eventually married her. She gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth, the famous Queen Elizabeth. Because she did not supply a male heir, Henry actually eventually has her beheaded based on a form of treason that he kind of comes up with in 1536. He then took a third wife, Jane Seymour, who gave birth to a son who was Edward in 1537, and then she died 2 weeks later. Henry married 3 more times, but he did not have any other children. So he has a son, Edward, in 1537, but Edward didn't live for a very long time. Henry died in 1547, and then his 3 children ruled in succession after this. Edward was first because he was the male. He became king when he was only 9 years old. He was rather sick, and there were some complications at birth. That's why his mother, Jane Seymour, died at a very young age. He was always sick, and he did pass away after only 6 years in rule. Mary, who was Henry's oldest daughter, the daughter of Catherine, she took the throne in 1553 and then restored Catholicism as England's main church. She died, though, in 1558, and then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, came to the throne. Elizabeth is a famous queen of England, and she restored Protestantism. She was determined to return to Protestantism in England, and she forms what's called the Anglican Church, which became the legal Church of England, in which she was, like her father, the head of the church. Now, there were some other challenges that took place during this time. There was some opposition from the King of Spain, who was Philip II. He actually led an invasion of England, and there was a major battle in 1588 in which Elizabeth actually defeated him. And Spain had the strongest navy in the world at the time, called the Spanish Armada, but they lost to the English in this specific battle. And then there were also some economic troubles that England faced during this time as well. So what we have here is the start of the Protestant Reformation. Section number 4 talks about how the Reformation spreads into other parts of Europe. Thank you.